We are going to start topic 11. Maybe I'll make a quick note about the midterm. I know I've had a couple people asking, and no, I have not looked at it yet. I have another midterm I'm grading for another class, and I have another midterm coming up, so I'm working on a review session for that third class. So this midterm here is going to have to wait for a couple of days. So hopefully I'll have it done by Tuesday at the latest would be my guess. If with any luck, it'll be done it a little bit earlier. I know some people are anxious about knowing how they did, so hopefully I can get that done really quickly. So today we're going to be talking about epidemiology and disease transmission, which is a very interesting topic, and but we're really only going to spend about maybe a little bit more than one lecture on it. Hopefully you'll get a lot out of it, and you know, if it's something you're interested in, you can learn more about it as well on your own. So another quick reminder here is that now that midterm 2 is done, if you haven't started already, time to start thinking about your assignment. These are due November 10th. Maybe next week I'll say a little bit more about them because there have been a few questions about various things. But if you haven't, please take a look at that, and you may want to get started on it. It's worth 15% of your grade, so it's a good way to boost your grade if you do well on it. And it's not hard to do well on it. You just have to do the research. You have to, you know, give me something nice, not made out of crayons, and you know, like I said, doing the research is part of it, and making sure you articulate yourself well. And I see someone has a question about referencing, and maybe I'll address that next day, because I know there's been a couple people who've asked me questions about referencing. So, but today I want to talk about epidemiology. So let's get into this. So here's a graph, and epidemiology is often about graphs because it's looking at data and trying to understand trends. So you can see this is a graph looking at the top 10 causes of death in high-income countries. So you can see heart disease is up there, strokes, cancers, a few other things like that. And you can see that in the red, we've got infectious diseases. So take a look at this graph here. So this is looking at low-income countries. And you can see it has a much different profile. And you can see that infectious diseases are much more of a concern, a lot more death and disease burden due to these things. So this is partly what epidemiology is all about. It's looking at trends. This trend here is a pretty big, obvious one. You know, we're looking at major differences in causes of death in different countries. And obviously income is a big, important part, because income helps us to have good health and a whole variety of other things that protect us against disease. I'll show you something that's a little bit more specific. So here's another one. This is looking at Lyme disease cases. And so we've known for a while now what causes Lyme disease, but go back a few decades, and actually we've known since the 90s what causes Lyme disease, just looking at the dates on these. But you can imagine if you did not know the cause of Lyme disease. You just have these symptoms, a new disease, we're trying to make sense of it, and I'm looking at the graph on the right. And you can see in the graph on the right, you definitely have a profile around the disease. We got a lot more cases kind of July, August, late fall. And so, you know, what is going on here? You know, are vacations causing Lyme disease? It has something to do with the sun. And you probably know now that Lyme disease is spread by a tick. And so it has a lot to do with the tick's life cycle, right? And so this is what epidemiology is all about. It's looking at patterns, trying to explain those patterns, and ultimately, hopefully, prevent disease and prevent disease in populations. So you can think of epidemiology, like I said, as looking at groups of people. So things like transmission and patterns and all those kind of things. I'll show you a couple other examples. If I can advance my slide. So here's one. This was a few years ago now, but it's been actually very hard to find information on disease outbreaks in Alberta or other places that are recent that have nothing to do with COVID. And so here's an Alberta outbreak in 2010. And this is syphilis. So there were a number of babies, 4 killed due to syphilis in Alberta, 3 in the Edmonton area. And if you look at, this is again 10-year-old data, looking at the syphilis rate, so 7.4 cases per 100,000 people. So 5 years previously, it was 4.5 per 100,000 people. And they noticed there's a higher frequency in sex trade workers. So, you know, this doesn't sound like a lot of people, but, you know, as public health, we do not want Alberta to be the syphilis capital of Canada. Hopefully, we're trying to prevent that kind of thing. And there's some data there. So what do they do, right? Obviously, looking at sex trade workers, there's going to be outreach to sex trade workers, right? Maybe looking at prenatal testing because newborn babies are at risk. And other at-risk populations as well are going to be important. And the reason why this one was important, or a good example, is because I remember reading about this in the news, and I swear it was the very next day, hopefully you can see in my video, I found these posters around Canada College. So, coincidence? Maybe, maybe not, but you don't necessarily see a lot of syphilis posters at Canada College, but there was a syphilis outbreak in Alberta. Not a lot of cases, not necessarily Fort McMurray, but at the same time, students tend to be higher risk population when you're looking at sexually transmitted infections. So it kind of made sense, right? I have another example here that was a couple years later. So this is 2015. This is also in Alberta. So we're looking at a whooping cough outbreak. And I don't like it when they have this data because it says Northern Alberta, and it turns out, so I was looking into this, and it took me a long time to figure out what Northern Alberta meant, basically anything north of Edmonton. So there were not a lot of cases in Fort McMurray, but there were a lot of cases in Calgary and then north of Edmonton, and I think it was some rural areas. So again, this is something where we have a disease preventable by vaccination and reminding people to, you know, get their pertussis shot updated if they haven't done in a few years. The immunity for pertussis isn't as strong as for some other diseases. So this was kind of one of these public health reminders to try to get people, you know, a reminder to vaccinate and check to see if you're out of date or not. So what are the objectives of epidemiology? I think I've said some of those things already. So sometimes for new diseases, it might be to identify the causes or the reservoirs of disease and the spread of disease. Help improve conditions, right? We want to prevent disease, right? And reduce the occurrence of disease. Those are big goals, but epidemiology, looking at the data, can actually do these kind of things. So, like I said, this involves a whole bunch of different things around transmission and behaviors and trying to find ways in public health to, you know, with these ultimate goals of reducing and understanding disease. So we're going to take a look at some definitions here. I've probably used a number of these words already and just want to define them a little bit more precisely. So one word is prevalence. So when we talk about prevalence, we're talking about the number that are infected right now. So this could be a percentage, this could be a number. So we could be talking about Fort McMurray, and we could say that, you know, right now we have 53 cases of COVID-19. Or we could say we have, you know, 1% of the population is infected right now with influenza or something like that. So that's prevalence. We use that word a lot. Incidence is the number of new cases within a certain time period, right? So this could be 13 new cases this week or something like that, right? So this is increasing above the prevalence. So if you see those words, that's kind of what they're all about. There's a lot of words around epidemiology, and I'm not going to go into them all. I know in the news they've been talking about the RO number and things like that, and we're not going to concern ourselves with that. Unfortunately, we can only cover so much. But prevalence and incidence are important. And these can be altered by deaths and cures, can affect prevalence, right? And so, you know, people will get cured or they heal naturally, the numbers are going to go down. Okay, so let's talk about these three words here: endemic, epidemic, and pandemic. These words are kind of used and abused, so it's worth it to know what they mean. And you can see here what I'm trying to show you is that these have to do with two things: numbers and geography. They have nothing to do with how bad a disease is or how likely it is to kill you. It has all to do with numbers. So let's take a look at endemic. So endemic, this is a disease that's normally being transmitted, and there's a predictable level. So here's an example: influenza. It's endemic in Canada, and so that means that every year we're expecting a certain number of hospitalizations and deaths. You can see those are some average numbers there. So about 12,000 hospitalizations and maybe 3,500 deaths. And there's going to be some, variance to that. The numbers could be, I think the range is actually 3,000 to 4,000 deaths. 4,000 would be a little high, but that's kind of typical numbers of influenza on an annual basis. And, we're not necessarily shutting down and locking down the economy for that. It's tragic when people die, obviously, but in terms of what we're doing, that's considered to be a regular, predictable level. So malaria is something that is not endemic. We don't have transmission of malaria in Canada normally, anyway. And so if we had a malaria outbreak in Canada, we would not call that endemic. But other places in the world, it is endemic. If you go to tropical locations, let's say you go to Senegal or Gambia in sub-Saharan Africa, during the rainy season, they're expecting people to start getting malaria, and it's a pretty normal kind of thing. So what is an epidemic? An epidemic is where we have higher than usual frequency. So what if we suddenly had 5,000 deaths from flu and 20,000 hospitalizations? That would be an epidemic, and that would be a concern. And so these are the kind of things we're keeping track of. There's a lot of famous epidemics. So one that, believe it or not, I used to have this in my course notes, and then I took it away because no one remembered SARS. But now everyone's talking about SARS again because we have SARS too. But let's talk about SARS Classic for a minute. So this is SARS coronavirus 1. This was 2003, 2002, and this was an epidemic. And most of the cases, I think there were a total of around 8,000 cases. Most of the cases were China, Hong Kong, and Toronto. There were a few cases in other countries, Singapore and I believe South Korea and a couple other places. So Toronto had, I think, 43 cases. And this was really scary. This came to Canada. It was one flight from Hong Kong, and boom, there were a bunch of cases in Toronto. They were all restricted to hospital. But out of those 43 cases, I think 18 deaths. All of the hospitals in Ontario were totally locked down. And somebody's saying a higher death rate. Yeah, like 43% of people who had it died. The good news is, in terms of this, when people got infected, they had symptoms right away, and the symptoms were very obvious: shortness of breath and those kind of things. And so it was easy to lock down and trace cases. Unlike SARS-2, where there's like a 3 to 3-ish day incubation period, and many people are asymptomatic, SARS-1 was easy to lock down. And well, we haven't seen it again, at least SARS-1. So here we are almost 20 years later, and we have a related coronavirus, which is totally giving us a different situation. And obviously everyone's familiar with that, about what's going on worldwide. But that's an epidemic, okay? It's restricted to certain geographical places. Why is it epidemic? Because we went from 0 to more than 0 cases, right? And so, these things pop up all the time. I would say every 2 to 3 years, there's an epidemic that's a serious somewhere in the world. We've had, actually, this is not even the most recent Ebola epidemic that I have here. The most recent Ebola epidemic is mostly in the Congo, I believe, and kind of tailing down now, but still ongoing. This was here until 2014, was the largest Ebola epidemic that we had known, and it was mostly restricted to these 3 countries. There was some spillover into some other countries, but I think it was about 95% of the cases were in these three countries, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. There were, a handful of cases that made it to the US. I think there were some cases in Nigeria. I can't remember all the countries, but this was, pretty scary. Ebola being a pretty scary disease in general, but this is an epidemic, again, not worldwide, right? But there's usually a few Ebola cases every couple of years, but not like we had in this year, which I think it was about 15,000 cases, which is very scary. Don't know what just happened to my computer. I think I accidentally touched it. Some more recent, we also have the Zika epidemic. Funny how no one's talking about Zika anymore. People were terrified of going on vacations in 2015. You can see this map is actually very interesting. You can see how Zika was, if you look at the little green and blue dots, right? So Zika was restricted to, again, we have sub-Saharan Africa. And 2007, I have no idea what happened in 2007. It's going to all these places in the Pacific. And then eventually it made the jump to the Americas. And so, some people are still talking about it, but not so much. So these are epidemics. Like I said, cases that are higher than usual. There was a bunch of cases of measles in Disneyland. I can't even remember what year that was now, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And, when you go from very few cases to a few dozen cases, that's an epidemic. So what's a pandemic? Pandemic means, usually we're saying worldwide. Sometimes people mean country, but usually we're saying worldwide. And so one of the most famous historical pandemics was 100 years ago, the Spanish flu. Sometimes people are calling it, although it didn't originate in Spain. It originated in the United States. And there's a photograph there of some sort of airplane hangar that's been converted into a emergency hospital. This was super scary. Very high percentage of people died from this. I think it was 5%. It was a brand new virus. And, there were lockdowns and all sorts of interesting things that parallel to what's going on today, except for a lot more people died from it, at least so far. We'll see what happens with our current pandemic. There was another flu pandemic. One thing I forgot to put on this slide is that the 1918 flu was an H1N1 virus. And then we saw another H1N1 virus in 2009 and 10. And again, people were freaked out because, of course, how bad was this going to be? Was this going to be like the Spanish flu? And it turned out that most people did not get violently ill like the Spanish flu. Some people did, but the disease burden was a lot less. You can see here's people in Mexico City. I'm showing this because, you know what, they don't get flu outbreaks in Mexico. It's a warmer climate. Usually the flu doesn't spread quite as well in warmer climates. But in this case, it was. Lots of people were getting sick. Some people were getting very sick. And the crazy thing about this particular flu is that young people were getting really sick. Usually with the flu, it's more elderly people are more at risk. And so, this was showing a bit of a different profile than your typical seasonal flu virus. So, like I said, the good news is we had a vaccine within 6 months. And in terms of the number of deaths, it wasn't a 1918 flu pandemic, although some people did die from it. It was a true pandemic because you can see it was spread worldwide. You can see lots of countries we don't have data for, but it did get spread worldwide. And the number of cases, we have no idea, but it was huge. And then, of course, we have our current pandemic. So, one of these things about these slides is just to try to show people is expect these things. Every 3 to 4 years, there's going to be an epidemic somewhere. Some of them are going to go pandemic. And you know what? It may or may not affect you, right? Zika. Probably most people that I'm talking to are not affected by Zika, unless you're traveling to or from Brazil. But who knows, right? The mosquitoes may spread and they may come further north due to global warming. This was a map from April 5th. And, at that point, it had been officially declared pandemic. And you can just see from the map that it has reached every continent, except for maybe Antarctica. Here's a more recent one. I just pulled this one up last night. I guess in some ways the profile hasn't changed so much, although Canada is looking really good, you got to admit, compared to places like south of the border. We went from 70,000 worldwide cases to, you know, a recorded 45 million worldwide cases. And that's probably not everyone has been diagnosed, right? It's only thus how many cases have been actually diagnosed. So this has been quite something to live through. And like I said, expect more of these things in the future for sure. Hopefully, we're not going to see anything this bad again. But you live 100 years and you never know. So what about AIDS? Let's talk about HIV and AIDS for a couple of minutes, because this is something that in my lifetime, I remember when it suddenly became a thing. You know, like any new disease, people were like lots of questions and fear. Could it be spread by mosquitoes? You know, that was a serious concern, right? When you've got a disease like this. And you can see the number of cases, it was originally characterized in the early 80s, and the number of cases, of course, skyrocketed, right? And so because when it was a new disease, it was definitely an epidemic. But if you take a look at just this graph here, and I know this is old data, but the number of cases of AIDS and HIV has basically leveled out. So now, at least in North America, AIDS is usually considered an endemic disease. So what does that mean? It means that we're expecting in Canada, there would be a certain number of new cases per year. And, you know, probably not an increase. We're hoping for a decrease if we have good education and people, you know, have safer practices. And some programs have been able to decrease the number of new HIV cases. But usually, you know, now it's considered endemic. And a lot of people don't like to use that word with AIDS and HIV because it certainly sounds like it's mild and not serious. And like I said before, these words have nothing to do with how serious the disease is. The disease could be life-threatening or it could not be, but endemic just means the number of cases. Often though, I'm still seeing in the news, people are talking about the AIDS epidemic, right? And particularly they're referring to certain countries in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa where the number of cases are massive, right? Like take a look at this graph here. This is 2014 statistics. And, you know, if you look at, so where's North America? Okay, North America is included in this purple blob along with Europe, right? So maybe 2.4 million cases. You compare that to sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking at, you know, 25, 26 million cases. So this is not proper language unless those cases are increasing, right? And above the usual. But like I said, a lot of people are trying to use that word to emphasize that this is serious. We got to take this seriously. And it is epidemic if you compare it to, you know, the 1980s. Again, you know, it's probably fair to say that it's endemic. And the number of cases in different geographical locations, you know, there's a lot that could be said about that. And I will say more about that when we get to our lectures on the immune system when we talk about AIDS and HIV in more detail. So still seeing the word pandemic as well, right? This is 2013 data, and I can't remember what article I saw that was calling it pandemic. And again, because it is a worldwide issue. But like I said, the word endemic is probably a better word to use, unless the cases are actually increasing. And I think actually in some cases they are. I think I was reading an article about, was it Uganda? The number of cases had leveled off for about 10 years or so. And the last few years they're on the increase again. So again, that would be epidemic for Uganda. So like I said, this has nothing to do with virulence or how serious the disease is. It has to do with geography and numbers. Okay, so let's talk about communicable diseases. And what does that mean? It means these are diseases spread from host to host. So this is most of what we're talking about in this course is contagious diseases that are being spread from host to host. Sometimes we talk about non-communicable diseases, and usually in the literature we're talking about diseases that are caused by environmental things. So sometimes the lifestyle, you can see we've got things like smoking and unhealthy diets, you know, but it could include, you know, other environmental causes, right? You know, sometimes people are exposed to carcinogens in their environment. It's not their fault. But for microbiology, there are some non-communicable diseases. And those would include diseases that where you're not getting the microbes from another host, but you are getting the microbes from somewhere. So for example, you could get the microbes from yourself. So maybe you have staphylococcus living on your skin, and then you get a wound and the staphylococcus is introduced to your bloodstream. So that would be a good example there. Sometimes we can get organisms from the environment, so not another host, but maybe from the soil. And so I'll come back to these examples in a few minutes here. So another thing I want to talk about is reservoirs of infection. So what is a reservoir? That means that's where the organism is growing and living naturally, right? So we talk about reservoirs a lot, and sometimes this is something we're trying to figure out for diseases like Ebola. We don't know what the reservoir for Ebola is. We suspect it's bats, but what species of bats is debated, and it hasn't actually been proven yet. So it's the kind of thing where we're still working on it. So I have 4 reservoirs of infection. So one reservoir, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, is something like your normal flora. So for example, many people get bladder infections. So what is going on there? Bladder infections are often caused by E. coli, and I keep telling you how harmless E. coli is, or usually harmless, or mostly harmless. I keep using those terms around E. coli. And so what is going on there? Well, E. coli is normally living in your intestine. So that's fine. It's all good there. It's happy. You're happy. It's making some vitamins for you, et cetera, et cetera. But a bladder infection is where that E. coli can get into your urethra. And so that happens sometimes. Women tend to be a little bit more susceptible. Their urethra is shorter and it's a lot closer to their anus. So it's a lot more likely they may get bladder infections just due to that anatomical difference between women and men. So lots of cases where normal flora are causing infections of the body. They're just usually the case is they're going from one anatomical location to another anatomical location and causing some issues. Second one, obvious, are human carriers. We get the disease from another human, right? So sexually transmitted infections, transmitted from human to human. Gonorrhea or syphilis are good examples of that. Lots of other infections, usually we're getting them from humans. SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 are believed to have originated in bats. But most of us are not experiencing bats or interacting with bats. You're probably getting the disease from another human. Animals. So a lot of diseases are zoonoses. So this zoo, you probably know zoo has something to do with animals. And so zoonose is a disease that comes from an animal. And I have some slides here. In a moment, I'll show you some examples of some zoonoses. Abiotic, I mentioned from soil. Again, I have a slide on that as well. So here's some examples of some zoonoses. And, sometimes there's a fine line between these diseases. Are they a zoonose or are they not? Influenza is a good example where, a lot of influenza viruses are originating in birds or sometimes swine or pigs. And then they eventually just become a human-human transmission. A good example, though, is rabies. Probably many people are familiar with rabies because you have a pet who's getting a rabies shot. And, we don't want to be transmitting rabies to humans. One that you may not realize is a zoonoses is West Nile fever, and we're going to talk about that later today. This is a bird disease, and humans are kind of accidental hosts. Humans are not usually transmitting it from human-human. It's growing in the birds and getting transmitted by mosquitoes, but it's originating from birds. Bacterial, we talked about anthrax, we talked about bubonic plague. A lot of salmonella is from animals. So if you have a pet reptile, so a turtle or a snake, salmonella is really common in their fecal matter. Birds as well, right? So this is why, if you're handling your pet chicken or your pet snake, you want to wash your hands afterwards just to make sure you're not getting any salmonella. And Lyme disease, we're going to talk about that as well. The reservoir is small animals, not necessarily deer. I know sometimes it's confused with that, but really the reservoir are mice. A few others there, you can see ringworms, malaria can be. There's one form of human malaria that is transmitted from a monkey, but most of it is human-human. Okay, what about this abiotic thing? This is important for a lot of waterborne infections, so we're talking about water treatment in some places. and medical equipment may be important as well. I'll give you one example here of an interesting case study of looking at botulism. This was a community, a native community in Alaska, and you can see they're looking at the number of cases there over time. And this was kind of an interesting phenomenon here with botulism, because there was this tradition they were looking at, and where the botulism was coming from. So they were preparing this food. It was called stinky head, where literally fish heads are buried in the ground, and they ferment and make apparently a tasty meal or drink. I'm not really sure what it is. And you can see, if you look at the graph, something is happening in the 1970s where the number of cases are suddenly skyrocketing. So what happened in the 1970s? Well, plastic happened. Rather than just burying it in the ground, they were burying it in plastic. And so in all cases, we have this organism, Clostridium botulinum, is in the soil, but it's anaerobic. So it turns out that in the plastic containers was making a great incubation chamber for the botulism. And so the number of cases just started to skyrocket. And so again, some epidemiologists went there, figured out what was going on, and tried to help the people to change, what they were doing to prevent the cases of botulism. I see there's a couple of comments. Somebody had pretty bad H1N1, it sounds like, in 2009. And somebody's asking, what mode of transmission is mosquito considered? That's a vector-borne transmission. We're going to talk about that, modes of transmission here. I think that's coming up really quickly. So somebody's saying, is that why plastic food containers now have little holes in it? I have no idea. Probably something to do with the food science and preserving the food longer, but I have no idea. Somebody's saying raspberries and blueberries. I don't know if botulism is a risk for berries because they're not usually in the soil. Like I said, probably has something to do with keeping the right amount of moisture on it to prevent mold, but really have no idea. We need a food scientist to answer that question. So let's talk about modes of transmission. So if you see what we have here, we have a reservoir. So that could be an animal, another human, the soil, whatever, and then we have infection. So what is going on in between? So we're going to talk about kind of three areas here, and each of them kind of have some subcategories. And I've got lots of examples for you. So we have contact. That usually means some sort of direct contact or indirect contact. Vehicle, so vehicle, water, food, and air. And then vector. So vector usually means some sort of insect or arthropod. So let's take a look at all of these and take a look at some examples. We'll start off with contact transmission. So contact transmission, this was the one that probably makes the most sense. You are physically contacting somebody. You can see some examples there: handshake, kiss, sexual bites. Here's my joke of the day. That's not a progression. Those are just different examples. But you can imagine all sorts of different diseases that are transmitted in that way, right? Sexually transmitted diseases, common cold. Sometimes people get from, shaking someone's hand who had the cold, they sneezed into their hand. You can imagine all sorts of examples there where this is going to occur, right? So hopefully that one's really obvious. So what do I mean by indirect contact? So one form of indirect contact is through fomites. So these are non-living organisms, non-living items, right? So you can imagine all sorts of things. You could have you share a drink with somebody, or a utensil, or hopefully you're not sharing a toothbrush with anybody. That is kind of gross, but I guess it possibly happens. I have no idea. Doorknobs. What about hospital gowns? The list is endless. Currency, cash, cell phones. And it depends on, obviously, the organism has to be able to be stable on those places. So Staphylococcus, MRSA, is very stable in the environment and is often spread by fomites. So that's a good example. What about influenza? Sometimes. Influenza is usually respiratory, but if there's the right amount of mucus and moisture, there have been studies that show that the influenza virus can survive on money. So, maybe another reason for us to go cashless, I don't know. Let's talk about respiratory droplet. because this has been a big one that has been going around with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. And you can see I have a number there. It says usually less than 1 meter. So why are we saying 2 meters? I'll come back to that in a moment. So there's been studies, right? You can see here's a case where you know, literally somebody has you know, got the right amount of lighting, and you can literally watch those droplets. And most people's sneezes, you're looking at about 1 meter, right? And those droplets, I can't remember the exact size. I think they're about 5 micrometers in size or smaller. It's just gravity, right? So gravity is going to bring those respiratory droplets down. So why are we social distancing to 2 meters? Well, okay. In some circumstances, we can push those respiratory droplets a little further. Some people have bigger noses, it's true. And people with bigger noses tend to spread those respiratory droplets a little further. People with bigger lungs may have stronger sneezes. So like I said, most people, it's about 1 meter. It can go a little bit further in some cases. So, you know, the 2 meters is kind of just one, you know, in a little bit of a safer buffer zone. But really, like I said, you're looking at gravity occurring here. So I'll come back to SARS-CoV-2 in a minute. I have a little slide on it. So, but this includes all sorts of respiratory diseases. Things like influenza is a famous one for respiratory droplet transmission. Although, like I said, it can be spread on mucus and other places. And you can see here some posters from the Spanish flu, you know, telling people to wear a mask, cover your hands. You're going to get in trouble for spitting and coughing and those kind of things. So, you know, again, we're probably pretty familiar with this. So, you know, they're trying to teach people how to cough, you know, not to cough into your hands, cough into your sleeve, and you know, stay home, obviously, when there's a pandemic going on. So this was a huge campaign that came out in 2009 with the H1N1 pandemic, trying to tell people how to cough and watch out for respiratory droplets. So I have an interesting example here. You may have heard of this woman. Her name was Mary Malone. She was very famously called Typhoid Mary. And so, you know, what is going on here with Typhoid Mary? People kind of, you know, make fun of her now and then, maybe not fully understanding the story. It turns out she was a cook, and I don't remember what year this was, but I think it was about 100 years ago. And so it turns out that, you know, some of the people she was cooking for were getting sick, and some of them died. And they were getting typhoid. So typhoid is caused by a type of salmonella. So the salmonella was going to be, it's fecal orally transmitted. So that means it's coming from the feces and going to someone's mouth. So she was a cook. So what is going on there? Probably she wasn't washing her hands enough. It turns out that one of her, you know, treats she would make for her clients was peaches and cream. So you can see that would be, of course, a meal that's not cooked, and they were believing that that was actually where it was transmitted. So what is going on here? And well, okay, so you've got these public health experts trying to figure out what's going on at the time. They figure out that she is the person connected to all the people that got sick and died. They arrive at her door, and what does she do? She runs out the back and escapes. I kid you not. She changes her name to Mary something else. I can't remember what it was, and you know, resumes another job cooking. And some more people get sick and die, and they track her down and arrest her. And of course, like, she's totally offended. She's like, I'm not making people sick. I'm not sick at all. How could I possibly be spreading this illness? So they made her promise to not be a cook. And so she did something else. She was in a laundry for a while, and it wasn't making as much money. So she went back to cooking with another new name. Eventually, she got arrested and put in this home. And you can see she's laying there in the bed looking totally unimpressed. And the day she died, she would never admit that she ever got anybody sick. So that's what Typhoid Mary is all about. And, you know, if you ever hear people use that term. So thought I had a couple of questions here. By what method was salmonella spread? Yes, you know, a few different ways, right? But it's a foodborne illness. We'd probably say this is indirect. but you know, spread through fecal-oral route, right? And so, you know, this was a case of somebody who had basically a subclinical infection. So she wasn't having any symptoms, but was an asymptomatic spreader. So you may hear that term from time to time. So let's talk about foodborne and waterborne and airborne infections, because they're very important worldwide. And there's a lot of things that can be done about it. Sometimes it's things like sanitation or laws and whatnot. So it's worth talking about these things. So waterborne infections, you're looking at contaminated drinking water primarily. And you can see I have a huge list here of various waterborne infections. So in, you know, in Canada and some countries, you know, E. coli is a big culprit. And you can see there's a number of other ones on there. The ones I have in bold, by the way, are organisms that I have discussed or will discuss in this class. So the ones not in bold, not that they're not important, they're just ones that kind of aren't going to come up, right? You can see I've got a bunch of protists. We talked about Giardia. We talked about Cryptosporidium. The toxoplasma spread in cat feces can also be a waterborne illness as well. Viruses such as hepatitis A, so a whole bunch of different types of viruses and bacteria and all sorts of things. And a lot of this has to do with sanitation, right? You know, if our water treatment systems are working fine, usually we don't need to worry about these things. But sometimes there's outbreaks here and there in Canada, or sometimes people get them when they're traveling to locations that maybe the water sanitation is not as good as Canada. So I wanted to mention one, is it even on this list here? Yes, it is. So I wanted to just mention Legionella. So Legionella, if you take a look at this graph, this is looking at causes of waterborne outbreaks. This is American data. Canadian data is not too much different. And you can see we've got bacteria over here, but then we have Legionella, is also a bacterium, but it has a big special place on this pie chart, meaning that it looks like it's more than half of all the cases. So not typically spread in drinking water. So this is kind of the exception to the rule, and it's an important exception because, of course, we're looking at half or more of all cases of waterborne infections. So what exactly are we talking about? So most of these cases of waterborne infections, you're looking at some sort of gastrointestinal illness. So what do I mean by that? Vomiting and diarrhea and cramps. That's kind of the main thing, right? But Legionella is causing respiratory illness. So what is going on here? So let's talk about Legionella for a minute. So Legionella, by the way, I was looking for a picture of a hot tub on Google, and I found this, and I thought this was just hilarious. I have never seen this before, but apparently in some places people do this all the time. So I thought this is really funny. So where's this Legionella coming from? So it turns out that Legionella likes to grow in water in environmental places, and so wherever there's warm water, Legionella might be found. And so if and this happens, people have hot tubs, and apparently trying to get the chemicals just right is a really big bother. Maybe you don't treat your hot tub for a while, and the Legionella can actually get into the mists and vapors that are coming off of the hot tub. And so people inhale it, and they get basically a pneumonia-type disease, which is and a fever, which is what Legionella causes. There's lots of other places. There's been, I think last year in California, there was a Legionella outbreak, and I'm trying to remember what it was. It was like, there was a giant air conditioning unit on an apartment building, and I don't really know how air conditioning units work, but there was water involved, and water that was getting warmed up, and then it was ending up through the ventilation. So a bunch of people in an apartment building ended up getting sick. That's actually how it was originally named. Notice the term Legionella. There were a bunch of people at a Legionnaires conference. So Legionnaires are people that used to serve in the military, right? And a bunch of them got sick at a convention of some sort. And so it was named Legionella. Somebody's asking, would it be found in hot springs? So if you go to like the hot springs in Banff or Jasper, they do treat the water, right? Natural hot springs, you know, that you find out in the wild, I don't know. Presumably, I don't know if there's other conditions in terms of around Legionella for environmental reasons. I just know it's found in a lot of human-created warm water situations. But out in the wild, I'm not entirely sure. It's a good question. So no gastrointestinal symptoms, usually respiratory symptoms like pneumonia-like disease. Sometimes this is called a Pontiac fever as well. I'm not sure why it's called that. Probably has nothing to do with the back of the truck hot tub. So I guess I said this already. Infects the lungs, causes a pneumonia type disease. And so those symptoms are going to be things like a cough and wheezing and sometimes fever and aches and things like that. So Pontiac fever, legionellosis, Legionnaire's disease, has lots of names for some reason. So what about food? This is a little bit more common in Canada. We're talking about all sorts of possible food contaminations. So the sprouts, for some reason, seem to be on that list a lot. Sometimes we have recalls. I think there was a good recall. Was that 2 years ago? They were recalling all the romaine lettuce because of E. coli 0157. And of course, as soon as there's a romaine lettuce recall, I crave Caesar salads. But you're looking at all sorts of possible things out there, right? Ground beef, etc. And a lot of these are being contaminated with feces from something. So they could be the feces from manure. They could be feces that, in the case of the romaine lettuce, I think it was one of those situations where they had a romaine lettuce farm, and then next door was some sort of cattle farm, and there had been some flooding, and so the manure from the cattle farm had flowed over land and into the romaine lettuce. So what are we looking at in Canada? A whole bunch of diseases that are often very similar to that list that you saw for the waterborne infections. If you're looking at the top 5 in Canada, top 5, we're looking at norovirus. It's huge. There's Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli 0157, and we're going to talk about E. coli 0157 a little bit more next day, and as to why that one is more pathogenic. So norovirus, worth mentioning, probably a million illnesses. Probably everybody here has had it, and it is not fun. Sometimes I call it the 2-bucket flu. So just think about that for a second, right? What do we need 2 buckets for? So vomiting and diarrhea, right? Lots of fun. Typical people have symptoms for a day or two, and it can be quite violent. And often, it'll go through things like daycares and schools, and cruise ships are very famous for having norovirus outbreaks. And it's not so much fun. So somebody's asking, is this what people call the stomach flu? Yes. So I don't like that term, but it is what often people call the stomach flu, is norovirus. And like I said, relatively violent and super infectious. There was a case a few years ago where somebody had it on an airplane, and I think it was within a week, 200 people got sick from that one outbreak that they traced. It's just super, super infectious. So we'll talk a little bit about norovirus here and there in the next few lectures. Here's one more interesting fact about norovirus. We can't culture it in a lab. We don't know how to do that. So how do you study it? Well, there's a related mouse virus that people study that they try to get a lot of data from. But if you want to study the human version of norovirus, human volunteers. So I don't know what they're paying people to sign up for that one, but that does not sound like fun. But we don't know how to grow it in a lab. That's the only way to grow it, human volunteers. So this is, I found this little chart here. This is American data, and I thought this was interesting. Just looking at the values here, we got leafy greens. I'm not exactly sure whether they're meaning lettuce or not, but you can see sprouts is on there. I was expecting sprouts to be a much bigger wedge on this because it seems there's always sprout recalls. Why leafy greens? Why romaine lettuce? I was curious about that question myself, and I spent a little bit of time looking into it, and it turns out it just has to do with popularity, right? I mean, how many people right here eat sprouts? I can't even tell you the last time I ate sprouts. It was probably 10 years ago on a Subway sandwich because I figured I would give it a try. But romaine lettuce, people eat it all the time. It's a much larger crop, a lot more people eating it. So it's just kind of a, kind of a quirk like that in terms of the statistics. More likely to eat it, more likely to have a foodborne outbreak on it. So what about airborne? Airborne is worth talking about, and some people get it confused with respiratory droplets. So you could think of airborne as kind of this scenario. So you're looking at a much smaller size particle. I think I'd mentioned is 5 micrometers is the particle. And if it's larger than 5 micrometers, gravity kind of just drops it within about a meter or two. If something carries further, this is the definition of airborne. So usually we're looking at things carrying on dust particles. And so this is the kind of situation where if somebody had measles and they're in this room here, they're breathing the air, they're spreading the measles virus, they walk out. You come in, let's say 2 hours later, and you're not vaccinated against measles. You could get measles. It's floating around in the air. It's staying airborne. This is what airborne is, true airborne. Looking at diseases, and sometimes, you know, this can be very serious. Airborne, for example, for measles is the primary infection route. There are a lot of diseases that, like influenza is on this list of things that can be airborne. Primarily, influenza is spread by respiratory droplets, but you may have noticed that more people get influenza in kind of fallish winters, so November to February. So why is that? Well, it turns out that those respiratory droplets can dry out when the air is drier and cooler, and that preserves the virus, and some of the virus particles can actually, you know, become airborne. So not the primary type of spread for influenza, but it is possible, and there's been at least 1 or 2 interesting studies to show that influenza can be airborne, and that does lead to some of the more cases that we see in the cooler, drier weather. Yeah, somebody's mentioning about cold viruses. Yeah, I'm not sure if cold viruses have been shown to be airborne, but I would not be surprised if there's some studies on that. So it's pretty interesting stuff. There are some bacterial diseases that are also known to be airborne. Tuberculosis is one of them. Again, not the primary mode of transmission. There were some interesting studies done about 50 years ago where literally somebody had, I think what they had done was they started a guinea pig colony in the ventilation system. So, and this was a place where people were being treated for tuberculosis, and then they were monitoring the guinea pigs over time. So the guinea pigs were never in close contact with humans to show that and they were able to show that the tuberculosis was getting into the ventilation system and killing the guinea pigs. Sounds like an interesting kind of weird project, but you know, not feeling, I'm sure the guinea pigs weren't too happy about it. So I mentioned I was going to come back to SARS-CoV-2. So this is the virus that causes COVID-19. And this is what the data is showing, is that it has multiple forms of transmission, or at least we suspect. There were a bunch of scientists that were making a big deal and saying that it's spread by aerosol. Probably, though, all the data is showing that this is probably at least 95%. Some people are saying 80%. But you know, from what I'm seeing from the data is it's probably greater than 90, closer to 95% of all transmission is from that direct contact and respiratory contact. So how do we know this? This is all the epidemiological studies, right? We're looking at, you know, we've been tracing people. We've had, I don't know how many millions of cases now we've had. So we have lots of data for this. We do all this contact tracing. You find out somebody's been sick and you find out, okay, how did you get it? And in very high percentage of those cases, people are having close contact with somebody for more than 15 minutes. And that very strongly suggests direct contact and respiratory contact. It's a respiratory disease, so that also makes sense. People have done studies to show that it's found in the respiratory droplets. There have been a number of cases where people don't know where they got it from. And this is part of the data looking at aerosols. And there's probably enough data to suggest that in some cases it is spread by aerosols, in some cases spread by fomites. It's stable up to, I think, 5 days on surfaces, possibly longer. Again, if you have mucus and things like that, things can be stable longer. But the data seems to be showing that it's that close contact for more than 15 minutes seems to be the case. And particularly indoors. Outdoors, you're something like 20 times less likely to get it if you're having close contact with somebody outdoors. So multiple forms of transmission, not unique. A lot of diseases have multiple forms of transmission. So I was showing people a while ago this here. What does 2 meters look like? And of course, you know, in Fort McMurray, we have these bisons running around all over the place. So just think of putting a bison in between yourself and somebody else. You could also think of a set of cross-country skis or whatever. Sometimes people are saying 6 feet. 6 feet is a little shorter than 2 meters. But like I said, 1 meter is probably good for most of the cases. But if somebody has a big nose or an extra violent sneeze, you could probably project those droplets a little bit further. Okay, so there's the water, food, and air. Like I said, these all have specific definitions to them that epidemiologists talk about, and they get a little confused out in the media, which is, you know, not a surprise. So let's talk about mechanical and biological transmission, which is vector-borne. So vector-borne means carried by an organism, and usually we're talking about some sort of arthropod or insect or something like that. Once in a while, people will talk about something else, but usually it's some sort of arthropod. So mechanical infection happens. Usually we're talking about unsanitary kind of conditions. So you can see in this case here, you've got this guy and there's something unsanitary over in the corner. It's some sort of fecal matter. The fly is, you know, checking out the fecal matter, sitting on the poo, getting it all over its feet, and then it lands on the guy's hamburger, and the guy's eating the hamburger and getting sick. So this is mechanical, and you can imagine unsanitary conditions. This could include cockroaches or all sorts of various things out there. But it happens. Mostly this is sanitation kind of thing. Biological is something that is a little different. It means that the vector itself, so the insect or tick, is an essential part of that pathogen's life cycle. So we're going to talk about some important vector-borne diseases here in a moment. You can see in that case here, this person, it looks like they're getting malaria from a mosquito bite. So here's a list of some vector-borne diseases. There are more. There are many of them. I have 3 here that are in red. So red is for Canada. So that's the great thing about being in Canada. You know, there's kind of an old joke is what's a cure for tropical diseases? Winter. And so Canada has winter. And that means that a lot of vector-borne diseases can't transmit here because the vectors themselves don't survive the winters. But we do have some. The 2 important ones we're going to talk about are West Nile virus and Lyme disease. We do have a few others that are kind of rare, like you get like 3 cases in all of Canada annually kind of thing. But we're not going to talk about the really rare ones. Even Rocky Mountain spotted fever is really not a number of, not a ton of cases in Canada. I think it's more than 10, but not a lot of cases overall. So let's just take a look at, see here. So I think I showed you this slide here before, kind of talking about, you know, some of these vectors and said we'd come back to them. So we're going to talk about ticks and mosquitoes today, but of course we've talked about fleas already with the bubonic plague, and we've talked about the kissing bugs with Chagas disease, and so there are lots of important, there's all sorts of flies as well that can cause various diseases in different geographical locations, like African sleeping sickness is one we talked about. So let's talk about Lyme disease. Okay, this is something that has been getting a lot of press for about 10 years now. The number of cases seem to be going up, and there's been some people that have gotten really sick. Particularly some famous Canadian celebrities have spoken out about Lyme disease. You may have heard of Shania Twain, Avril Lavigne, and Justin Bieber were all Canadian celebrities that suffered through pretty serious cases of Lyme disease. And so they've all talked about it publicly. If you're a fan of any of those people, I'm sure you can find some of those interviews. So these are spread by ticks, and 2 species of ticks in Canada spread it. I'm not sure how to say that. Ioxides, I'm not exactly sure how to say that one. I maybe have to look that one up. But they have common names, the black-legged tick or the western black-legged tick. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the western black-legged tick is west of the Rockies, and the black-legged tick is east of the Rockies. So that's kind of the general geographical distribution. That being said, ticks are kind of crazy. They can get on birds, and there was one, everyone in Yellowknife was freaking out. I think that was 2017, because one of these ticks was found in Yellowknife. And they figured it probably was brought with either somebody's dog from traveling somewhere else, or a bird. So somebody is asking, can we say that living in BC would put us as much risk as living in warmer climate, not in Canada? Yeah, I mean, generally the warmer places in Canada do have more spread of things like Lyme disease, for sure. And well, I'll show you some maps here in a moment. So these are the ticks. You can see these are the sizes of them compared to the Canadian dime. And the one that's the most important for humans is this one here. Oops, the nymph. Look at how tiny that thing is. It's the size of a poppy seed. So, of course, somebody did this. They said, hey, let's put some of these things on a poppy muffin. So I apologize if this is your favorite kind of muffin. Hopefully it doesn't ruin it for you. But can you see the ticks? I have to look very carefully to find them. Zoom in. Can you see them now? Maybe. So there they are. There's 5 of them sitting on there. So these are very tiny. So it's very easy to get this and not realize you have the tick on you. So here's the good news. I'll talk about you know, what we can do about these things in a minute or two. But the good news is that this tick really has to be on your body for a good 24 hours before it can actually give you the disease. So if you go into an area that has a lot of ticks, let's say you're hiking with your dog or whatever, you know, take your clothes off and have a shower. And that should take care of it in most cases. The clothes can go in the dryer. A hot dryer will actually kill the ticks. Like I said, they really need to be embedded for 24 hours before they, like, it takes them that long to do their meal. It's a very crazy process about what they do, which I don't have time to get into. So let's talk a little bit about these ticks. So I know a lot of people talk about them as being on deer, and certainly these ticks do bite the deer, but humans are more likely to be bitten by the nymph tick, and the nymph tick actually would have been feeding on a mouse. So deers are kind of part of this cycle, but usually they're not the ones spreading to humans. The thing about deer is they're more visible, and where the deer are, the mice are also likely to be. So they can be a good indicator for the spread of these things. So notice these ticks, they, believe it or not, twice in their life they feed, and they get these blood meals. And, you know, you can see that poor tick is, or that poor deer is just coated in ticks behind the ear. So someone is talking about living in Winnipeg, and they go camping in coolers and camper, and everything will be crawling with ticks. So the good news is in Winnipeg, they don't have as many of these type of ticks. They're probably looking at what I would call a wood tick. I grew up in Northern Ontario, and in June, you would see these things crawling all over the grass, just ready to jump onto your leg. Thankfully, those ones do not carry disease, but these ticks are moving, and I'll show you a map in a moment here. So they get bigger. You know, I remember picking them off the dogs like grapes. They're really gross. Remember one time getting a haircut, and the hairdresser found a tick in my head. I'm sure that was really fun for her. She freaked out. So here's kind of the life cycle. I'm not going to get into all the details on this life cycle. You know, kind of the takeaway points is you've got these ticks. They lay their eggs. Eventually they hatch, and they're looking for blood meals. So you got the larva. You can see the larva is, they usually get mice because the mice are close to the ground. And then they feed on the mice, and they become nymphs. So I don't know a lot about these things in terms of, you know, how these life cycles work, but interesting, they go from 6 legs to 8 legs. So kind of a weird thing going on here. And the nymphs are the ones that are looking for something bigger. They tend to be on grass, and so they're more likely to get a larger animal, such as a deer or a human. And so, you know, this is where the humans come in. They feed on the deer. That's where they breed, is on the deer. So the back of the ear on that one is probably the where they're trying to breed, and then they're going to lay their eggs. So the human is kind of just in there as an accidental host, not normally part of the life cycle, but you know, we can get them on our legs. And like I said, they're often found on grass, and they actually, they don't jump, by the way, but it's kind of, there's a term for it, it's called questing. So they climb up a strand of grass and kind of just sit there, reaching their little claws out and hoping something will brush by. So let's talk a little bit about Lyme disease itself. It's caused by this organism called Borrelia burgdorferi. That's named after a guy, and they're spirochetes. And so they're spirally, they have endoflagella, and they can burrow to a whole bunch of different tissues. So if you get Lyme disease, about 85% of people get a bullseye rash. So if you get a bullseye rash, that is good, because there's one other disease on the planet that gives you this exact type of rash. It's also caused by a tick, not in Canada. So it's very easy to diagnose, and they're going to give you antibiotics to kill the bacteria. Sometimes people get other symptoms, fever, chills. Those are pretty typical symptoms of a lot of illnesses. Headache, fatigue, and swollen joints. So, you know, those kind of things aren't fun. The sooner you get treated, the better. The sooner you get treated, the better. Because as I mentioned, these spirochetes can start invading other tissues. And that's where things can get quite serious. And I'll show you some of the other symptoms as well. Someone's talking about spider bites don't give bullseye bites. Not as familiar with with spider bites. They may get smaller, kind of similar rashes, but in terms of the bullseye rash from Lyme disease, it's pretty distinctive. And it grows, by the way, too. It starts off smaller and kind of radiates and grows bigger. They can be quite large, up to 10 or 20 centimeters in some cases. Often in lymph areas. So we're looking at behind the knees, sometimes on the back, where lymph nodes congregate. Not necessarily where the bite actually happened. So later symptoms, if people don't get treated right away, we can talk about much more serious symptoms. This is actually not the complete list. We can see some typical symptoms: headaches and stiffness and pain, extreme fatigue. I saw the interview with Avril Lavigne, and she was talking about barely being able to get out of bed in the morning for months. And you know, how hard that was, because of course she's an entertainer and she likes to, you know, interact with people, and just not being able to do that. But some people, it invades other tissues, and you can see things like heart palpitations. That can be very serious. And in some cases, I don't know if I have a slide of this. No, I don't. In some cases, people are getting long-term effects from having Lyme disease. And we don't fully understand all the stuff that is going behind that, but some of these long-term effects are believed to be autoimmune. So the bacteria is gone, but there's autoimmune situation going on where the body is attacking the joints and those kind of things. And unfortunately, you know, when you get to these kind of symptoms, right, like, you know, everybody here today, who has some stiffness today, who has some fatigue, who has a headache, probably all of us have these kind of things on a weekly basis. And some people, there's a whole bunch of chronic diseases that people have, you know, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. They're hard to treat, hard to diagnose, and you know, in some cases, these are connected to Lyme disease. So a lot more could be said about that, but I do need to move on. So it is really fascinating to have been watching Lyme disease as it has become a really big issue in Canada in the last 10 to 20 years. So here's my map. So I had some official maps I could have showed you. They weren't very good, so I drew my own for you to show you where Lyme disease seems to be distributed in Canada. So I think 85% of the cases are Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, by the way. So if you're from one of those places, and by Ontario, I mean the southern, kind of eastern end of Ontario, and they were talking about in Ottawa, apparently last spring or the previous spring, there were so many cases and so many ticks, it was unbelievable. And I know I've talked to some people from Nova Scotia, and particularly people that, you know, they're talking about 10, 20 years ago, it wasn't as bad. But it has spread. So you can see Manitoba and Northern Ontario there. You know, so that's where I grew up, and I remember hearing about Lyme disease, but had never known anyone who has had a case. And then my aunt had a case, my brother-in-law had a case, so it's kind of, it's spreading, right? And we're starting to see more cases. British Columbia, particularly west of the Rockies, you've got the other type of tick. I see there's a question here, is it a chronic disease? There are some chronic forms of Lyme disease. Like I said, some people who don't get treated right away can have chronic symptoms, and some people end up with these symptoms that we poorly understand. It's called post-treatment Lyme disease. They don't like to use the word chronic Lyme disease because the bacteria has been cleared from the system. So post-treatment Lyme disease, or I think is what they call it. And so, like I said, the symptoms are fatigue and sometimes arthritis and things like that. So not fun at all. So what are the number of cases? I'll get to that in a second. I was going to show you these maps. I found this on CTV. No author, no reference, but this is somebody's projection. So you can see 2000, 2020, this was their projection. So they're a little off, I think. But you can see what they're trying to do is show you that what is happening here. Well, we are getting a little bit of climate change, and there are some pretty good studies to suggest that that the mice that carry the bacteria do seem to be spreading further north. So you know, it looks like by 2080 they're projecting Fort McMurray will have more Lyme disease. But I'll show you the actual number of cases that have been kept track of. So this is the number of cases in Canada. It's only been a reportable disease since 2009. And so this is the number of cases. This is probably not representing all the cases. And there's a huge debate about how many cases there actually have been compared to how many cases have been reported. Some people think it's maybe 50%. Some people maybe think only 20% of cases have been recorded, but we're not really sure. You can definitely see an upward trend. Definitely there's some you know, things going on in terms of, you know, how healthy the ticks are. 2017 was apparently a good year for them. I'm not sure why that year in particular was really good for them, but the number of cases are going up, and more people know somebody who've had Lyme disease. So what about Alberta? This is what we really want to know about. The most recent data I could find for Alberta was 2016 for some reason. And so there have been 88 cases of Lyme disease, and all likely imported, meaning that each case the person had been traveling to Nova Scotia or Ontario or something like that. There definitely have been more cases. I know in my travels I've talked to people that said, oh yeah, back in 2007 I had one of those bullseye rashes, but I never did anything about it. So you know, these things seem to happen, right? We do have a tick surveillance program in Alberta. And so you can see there's the numbers that people can submit ticks. So you can submit them to your veterinarian. Sometimes people get them off their dog. There's a couple of places in town, I can't remember exactly where we can submit the ticks. But 34 were positive for the bacterium, so it's here. Just doesn't seem to be transmitting to people because the number is so low. What about Fort McMurray? We found 2 ticks in Fort McMurray in the last 5 years. One of them was reported to be kind of behind the Sobeys and Thickwood, so somewhere in that area. And then the other one, I think, was it Anzac or someplace like that? I can't remember off the top of my head. So what can we do about Lyme disease? We can move further north. It's kind of a funny joke because, of course, we are pretty far north in Fort McMurray. We can cover ourselves when we go for walks in the woods. So they're suggesting, you know, you have your pants and no bare ankles, remove those clothes afterwards. You can apparently buy these little tick removal devices and, you know, check your body. I know some people do a regular check of their dogs after going for walks, and because dogs can get Lyme disease as well. And like I said, something that you can do is remove your clothes if you think you're in a tick area and have a quick shower. A nice hot shower, and that should get rid of it. So anyway, we do have to move on here. I'm just looking at the time. I'm realizing I'm running out of time. I was hoping to talk about, I probably have just enough time to talk about West Nile virus for today. So let's talk about mosquitoes for a minute. Some people are calling it the most dangerous animal in the world. If you take a look at how many children die from malaria, apparently every 45 seconds. So that's really sad. So what diseases are being spread by malaria? Canada, we care about West Nile virus. In this class, we also care about malaria, and probably I'll mention yellow fever, Zika I've mentioned a couple of times, but many organisms spread by a mosquito. Most of them are viruses. You can see I have one worm on that list. That's always kind of an interesting one to look at. So there are something like 3,000, maybe a little more than 3,000 species of mosquitoes. It turns out about 300 of them will actually bite humans. So mosquitoes are not like ticks. Ticks are not picky. You've got blood, they will bite you. They're just looking for the opportunity. Mosquitoes tend to be a lot pickier. Some of them will bite humans. Some of them don't want to bite humans, but they will if they don't have another choice. But often they are looking for certain species. There are different genre of mosquitoes. These are the important ones for disease. You can see we have the Aedes mosquitoes. Those are the ones that are spreading Zika and yellow fever. We've got the Anopheles mosquitoes, famous for spreading malaria. And then the Culex mosquitoes, you can see the name for these are house mosquitoes. And this is the one we're going to talk about right now. So let me see here. Just wondering here how much time I'm running out of time here, but let's talk about West Nile virus, and we'll probably pick it up when we come back next day. So what is, I mentioned already about West Nile virus, that it is a bird disease. So birds are the reservoir. That means they live in the birds naturally, and it's spread from bird to bird by mosquitoes. The Culex mosquitoes, those house mosquitoes. So here's the thing, birds are getting it, and back in the year 2000 when it arrived in Canada, some birds were dying from it. So what's happening with humans? Well, it turns out that, in some conditions, it gets hot and dry, and that tends to be when the birds like to fly away. And that's when humans start to get it because, of course, the birds can fly away and the humans cannot, and the mosquitoes are still there. So the mosquitoes will bite humans, and horses are particularly susceptible as well. And we can get West Nile fever. So West Nile fever is a lot like the flu. We get a fever, sometimes aches and shakes, those kind of things. And most people, it's a mild disease. Sometimes, though, it causes encephalitis. So encephalitis is swelling and inflammation of the brain, and that can be really dangerous, particularly if you're an elderly person. So nowadays, we kind of have a little bit better idea what to look for, particularly certain parts of the province. And I'll show you a map here in a moment. But with encephalitis, we can treat that. We can give a person corticosteroids to kind of reduce the inflammation. But it can be fatal in some cases. It can also be spread by blood transfusion in some rare cases as well. So humans are kind of an accidental host. So there's the distribution in Canada. So it turns out that there's two mosquitoes. You can see we've got the house mosquito here, which is Eastern Canada. And then we've got the Western encephalitis mosquito, which is kind of in Western Canada. And I'll just say a couple of things about that and then finish up for today. What's the deal with these mosquitoes? And I mentioned those hot, dry summers. Well, it turns out there's another kind of connection with hot, dry summers is that these mosquitoes like stagnant old water. So picture all the places where you might have stagnant old water, maybe in your eaves trough, maybe in a ditch somewhere. So in Eastern Canada, they tend to be more associated with homes, so garages and eaves troughs, because they don't survive the winter very well, but they can survive the winter with humans helping because we have lots of warm places. In Western Canada, you're talking about a little bit more farmland. So think about all the stagnant water. You've got a hoof print in a farmer's field, and a little bit of water collects in that. And so these mosquitoes like really stagnant old water, when there's slime on top, and that's where they go and lay their eggs. And then, they're going to spread the disease, the virus to birds usually, and sometimes humans. Okay, so let me just take a peek here. Maybe I will just say this slide. I know some people are worried about Zika. Zika has not been found in Canada yet. The mosquitoes are in the US, and so there are people monitoring to see if they're traveling north. So sorry, I've gone just slightly over here, but I'm going to finish up there for today. So we're going to come back to this topic next day, probably have about another 20 minutes, and then we'll cover topic 12 as well. And hopefully by then I'll have your midterms marked and we can talk about that as well. So I hope you all have a great day and a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and take care. Oh yes, and have a great Halloween. Don't eat too much chocolate.